So first, welcome to this webinar that we do with Axess Lab. This time we're talking about the wonderful topic of EN 301549 and what it brings to the table, and especially what makes it different from WCAG. First, a little bit of an introduction. So my name is Eric Eggert. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a web accessibility specialist at Axess Lab since 2022. And I'm also self-employed with a little consulting business called Outline for 15 years now? Yeah, it's getting long in the tooth, but I have done accessibility for almost 20 years now and worked for W3C, the Web Accessibility Initiative, who are creating all the good standards like web content accessibility guidelines and everything around it. And I'm based here in Wissen, Germany, which is a nice small town right between Frankfurt and Cologne, if you wondered. Because it's not that well known. Yeah, let's talk about what is this EN 301549 thing that I'm going to talk about. Basically, it is the basis of all accessibility in Europe, like the standard, the norm that defines what accessibility means in Europe. And it has this really nice PDF format that you can download. It's unfortunately a little bit difficult to handle, but it covers all the products and services that are covered by the European Accessibility Act, but it also covers the Web Accessibility Directive for public institutions, right? Oh, and before I go deeper into it, if you have any questions, put them into the chat, and I will answer. I will answer them at the end, and we're going to get through them. But I hope that I answer most of the questions with the presentation itself, because that wouldn't that be nice? Now you think, okay, so we have this EN accessibility standard, accessibility norm, whatever you want to call it. And the subtitle is Accessibility Requirements for ICT Products and Services. So information and communication technology, that's what ICT stands for. So basically, well, we do have WCAG, right? And the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, they do exist. So why do we need the EN? And I will give you the really big picture overview of why having the EN is useful and what it brings in addition to the EN. And I did put together this image that basically shows the WCAG in the middle, like the bowl with a lot of food in it. And then the EN has different things around it, like different bowls with rice and chips and what is that, corn, just to show okay, WCAG is the main thing, but then there are other things around it that are important, interesting for you and that you could be using. Because not everything that is in the EN covers everything. But the core of the EN 301549 is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They make the most or most of the document is WCAG or variants of WCAG, and I will talk about why and what that means in a second. Yeah, and then you have other things that cover other aspects of digital accessibility. And indeed, EN 301549 finds WCAG so nice that it has 3 variants of WCAG 2.1 in it, because one time WCAG is not enough, so we have 3 of them, and they are scoped to different types of information and communication technologies. So there's a WCAG referenced for web. There's one for non-web documents. So these would be your Word, your PDF, your other stuff that's not a web document, not a website or web application. And then there's software, which is for things that are programmed in terms of like, just apps on your phone or like applications on the computer, stuff like that. That's software. And so there is some overlap and stuff, but like I don't want to go into details because I think it's boring. And you can find it out when you read through the standard on your own, which you hopefully will be able to do at the end of this webinar. So for the web, because WCAG was made for the web, it is essentially WCAG 2.1. It does not have the preamble and some of the other information in there, and a lot of guidance is just like, oh, go out and do this WCAG thing. Like there is 9.1.1.1 is literally C WCAG 2.1, 1.1.1. So it's a one-to-one, almost one-to-one WCAG EN relationship there. For non-web documents, it's a little bit different. It lists all the WCAG 2.1 success criteria, and those are 2.1 AA success criteria for those who think in those types of categories. But it doesn't list the conformance requirements, and it has also some information about captioning, positioning, and audio description timing in there, which is an interesting change. But apart from that, it's also do WCAG 2.1 plus these other things. For software, it's a little bit even more complex or like additional requirements, and that's WCAG 2.1. The success criteria minus the conformance requirements, plus interoperability with assistive technologies, plus documented accessibility features. So you need to document for your users what accessibility features you have, plus user support for user preferences, plus authoring tools. So if you let users submit content to your site, to your application. So three like roughly WCAG shaped things in there. And that's well and good. And I could say, yeah, do WCAG and you almost have fulfilled the EN, but that's not really true. Because there is other stuff, like these are chapters 9, 10, and 11. So there must be at least 8 other chapters. And in reality, there's also chapter 12 and 13. So there's other stuff. So let's talk about what the rest is of the EN. And this is basically where the little pots around the main pot come in. Really trying to make this metaphor happen. So the first 3 are like very general introductory chapters. So you have scope. Basically, it says like what is a product and what is a service, and how does the EN apply to those products and services. Then the second one is references. It's basically a list of documents that are referenced. This includes WCAG, of course, but also other things that are relevant to the EN. And then there's the third chapter is a list of definitions of terms and symbols and abbreviations. So if you don't understand something and you want more context, you can go in there and just get your information on what the definitions are, and that's very helpful. But like, they are just, support for the document. We have that in WCAG 2, where we have the glossary at the end and stuff like that. So you have in your introduction, so you always have these things around the actual, content of the standard that like gives you support and makes sure that, it's easier to understand or understandable at all. So let's go to chapter 4. And chapter 4 is actually pretty important. I mean, all of the chapters are important if you want to meet the EN 301.549 norm, right? But chapter 4 has like a very interesting use case. Chapter 4 is for functional performance. And that chapter outlines how to meet the requirements of different people with disabilities. But it doesn't do it by saying, oh, a person with disability, with a certain disability needs to do this and that, which is often the approach that you read in like audit reports and stuff like that. They flip this. They say the product or service needs to meet certain requirements to be able to use for certain people. It is, in my opinion, an interesting change of perspective to say like, oh, does the website, what does the application, what does the ATM needs to do to be usable with like certain disabilities? And I think it's a really welcome thing to have this like written that way as it is. I have one example here that we're going to look at. And then basically 4.1, chapter 4.1 says, oh, you have to meet all these like functional performance statements. And also then the performance statements, to meet them, you need to go through chapters 5 through 13, which, 3 of them are WCAG. To meet those functional performance requirements. So those are testable requirements, testable criteria for ICT. And that's very interesting. So let's take a look at 4.2.1, usage without vision. And it says basically where the information and communication technology provides visual modes of operation, it provides at least one mode of operation that does not require vision. And then it goes on to say, this is essential for users without vision and benefits many more users in different situations. Like the second sentence, I don't think it's like super useful because like it already says in the heading that this is for users without vision or usage without vision. So I don't know how useful that is, but the first sentence is really good because it says like if there's a visual mode of operation, so if you need to see something to operate the ATM or the website or something like that, then there's a mode of operation that does not require that. So mode of operation would be, you have a headphone jack in your ATM that you can plug in and get like voice output, or for a website, it's compatible with screen readers, standard screen readers and stuff like that. So it's very straightforward. I think it's very easy to understand. It's basically the thing that you need to be able to at least have 2 ways to experience information. I think these are very good. They're very short and very to the point. And I think once you understood like what the idea is, you can basically go through all of them and understand them from the heading. And there are, apart from without vision, there's also usage with limited vision, without perception of color, without hearing, with limited hearing, with no or limited vocal capability. So let's say you're like driving outside of out of a parking structure, and like the only way to get out is to press a button and say, I want to get out. That would be not permissible because you might have no or limited vocal capabilities, right? The next are usage with limited manipulation or strength. So this is important for like proper like machines that you might operate. So you might not be able to like rotate your wrist as strongly, or you might not be able to push a button as strongly. Like let's say there is like a emergency off button. So maybe you don't need too much strength to press it because that could be a security hazard. Usage with limited reach. Minimize photosensitive seizure triggers, always a good idea. You don't want to give your customers or clients seizures. Usage with limited cognition, language, or learning. That is basically make stuff easy to understand, right? And then privacy, like this outlines what the privacy needs are. So for example, if you have speech output, you need to have a mode where you can have that speech output in private. So by plugging in, wired headphones, for example. Okay, we already got through one of the chapters, so I think I need to speed up a little. So if you have questions, put them into the chat if I'm going too quick. Then here's general, is the 5th chapter. It's one of the big ones, and it's mostly about closed functionality. And that is basically when you cannot bring your own technology, your own assistive technology to the product. So that might be something like an ATM. Cannot install your own screen reader on an ATM because that would be security-wise a little bit weird. And so you have to have things in there that that support you. Yeah, and there are a couple of sub-chapters, and I'm gonna really quickly go through them as well. So the first is closed functionality. That describes which functionality needs to be present. For example, it describes what the minimal font size is that you need to reach after you allow to zoom in, which is important. Then 5.2 ensures that you can activate an accessibility feature without relying on a method that does not support that need. So for example, if you're blind and you need to find on a touch screen the button to activate the screen reader and there's no tactile way to do that, then basically you cannot meet 5.2, and that means your ATM, your whatever machine does not meet the EN here. Then ensure that biometrics is not the only form of identification. If you can only identify by fingerprint and you don't have suitable fingerprints because of a disability, that's a problem. So that's 5.3 for you. And then 5.4 is to ensure that information stays intact when converting information from one format to another, which is very important. So if you have subtitles, you don't want to lose, for example, speaker information when converting from one format into another. Then 5.5, alternatives for grasping, pinching, twisting operable parts. So, some people with limited mobility just can't do very complex things like pinching or twisting. So you don't want to rely on them. And if you rely on them, give alternatives. 5.6, locking or toggle controls makes sure that it's always clear if something is locked or toggled. So that could be not only relying on a visual indicator, but also on a symbol or the state of the toggle or lock. And then there are things like key repeat and double strike key acceptance that basically make sure that if you press a key for a longer time, it does not repeatedly register, or that you have a mode that is tolerant to striking the same key twice. You don't want that to happen, and then someone with, again, limited mobility, that's mostly what this is about, would struggle to do proper inputs. And then simultaneous user actions. So if you have something where you need to push a button and rotate a wheel, you want to give users the option to do that in sequence, because otherwise, again, if a person only has one arm, then they cannot do it simultaneously. So there's a lot of these things that you can think about, especially if you're doing closed systems, hardware systems. Then I think the 5th general chapter is super interesting that way. Chapter 6 is interesting for other reasons, because that is about two-way voice communication. So WCAG does have some requirements for transmitting audio and video, but it's all about broadcasting. So basically you have one source and you broadcast to a lot of people, like this, what we are doing right now, covered by WCAG. If we were in a two-way conversation, then that would not be covered by WCAG. technically, like, you can argue that it kind of is, but technically it isn't. And that's always the best kinds of discussions. So the EN said like, oh no, we have to make this really clear that two-way voice communication is covered in terms of accessibility requirements, and that's why this chapter exists. And it's basically for, as I said, two-way voice communications, and so it complements WCAG really nicely there. It has a couple of very interesting things like audio bandwidth for speech, so you don't have chopped up or low quality audio. I think that's a very good idea to have. It also requires real-time text, so you can type, and what you type is in real time transmitted and shown to the person on the other side. Caller ID, so you can identify who is calling in and who is speaking. Very important. That you have alternatives to voice-based services like chat. Some things about video communication, how to make them more accessible. And then alternatives to video-based services, so you don't only rely on video. And this is only in two-way conversations. Then you go, the next step is like, but there's video outside of these two-way communication situations. And that's where you go into ICT with video capabilities, chapter 7. And this is specific information about video playback. I think most of that stuff is covered by WCAG, but I think it complements pretty okay. So I have some highlights here. 7.1 is caption processing technology, and especially captioning synchronization, sorry, and preservation of captioning. So the first one says, basically defines how in sync captions need to be to speech. And the second one says captioning needs to be preserved when you, again, go from one format to another or from one platform to another. So very important things. I don't know how you would test that in practice, because, all the videos sometimes have different like qualities of captioning and stuff like that, but at least it's in there and you have something to like benchmark against. Then you have to support audio description technology, and you have to give the user controls for captions and audio description. This is something that WCAG does not require. Like, it just says like, you have to be able to show captions and audio description, but there's no like, the user needs to have like controls over them, and this basically gives the user much more controls. Then there's a whole chapter about hardware. So that's very specific to the ATMs and vending machines and stuff like that. One highlight that I have is standard connections. So if you have something where you need to plug in, for example, an audio jack or like a USB C jack to like, exchange accessibility information or get output or input, then it needs to be a non-proprietary format, or there needs to be a commercially available adapter for it. So that's important. It also covers things like forward or side reach. So when you have like a table in the way between you and like a monitor or like a touch screen, then that impedes the ability for a lot of people, especially in wheelchair users, as the illustration shows in the standard, prevents them from reaching like very high or very low in some cases places. That rhymed. And the nice thing is you know exactly what the expectations are in the EN. And so you can, make sure you design your hardware around it. Yeah, it has things like hardware products with speech output, stationary ICT, mechanically operable parts, and tactile indication of speech mode. It's all like overlapping with stuff that was in chapter 5, the general things, but this is like way more specific. Like, for example, it does describe how the tactile indication of, speech mode, like output mode, voiceover mode, whatever you want to call it, how that looks, and what the requirements are. So you have like more in-depth details over the general chapter. And then we have 9, 10, and 11, which are the WCAGs. We already talked about that. And then you go to 12. And 12 is interesting, especially if you are a company and you have to meet EN. Like, this has less to do with testing and like remediation and technology. This has to do with documentation and support services. So this basically means that you have to provide a product documentation that has accessibility and compatibility features, and that your documentation that you just created for your product, that is also accessible. So it's not enough to like just put, if you sell a product, to just put like a flyer into the box and be done with it. No, you actually have to make an accessible documentation. So put your documentation online, in a format that people can actually use. So don't use PDFs, please. It's really important. But this is not something, that's something that you can test in an audit, that it exists and that it's accessible. But it's not something that, like, after an audit, you would write or I would write for a client. Like, the client needs to do this to meet this EN requirement. And then there's support services. So that means help desk, call centers, technical support, relay services, training services. They all need to be accessible as well. And there are specific requirements. It's not like a long chapter, but it basically says like, oh, your help desks also need to have something that is not voice communication, stuff like that. All also covered in the general. A lot of that is also covered in general, but it's reiterated, and I think that's generally good. Chapter 13 is the last chapter, and it's ICT providing relay or emergency service access. So these are specific things, like if you are a provider for emergency services. So if you're police or fire department or something like that, then this applies to you. I just assume that most of you are not working in that space, so I will skip over details, but if you are, there's a specific thing that you need to look at. Speaking of things to look at, the future. So we're in the space year of 2026, and the current version of the EN is version 3.2.1. Don't ask me how these versions come together. It's a total mystery to me. There is a new version announced that will be the version 4.1.0. As I said, don't ask me how they get to that. And it's apparently coming out soon, but there have been like some shenanigans going on. It will, when it gets released, probably in the fall, maybe early next year. Like, it's very open at the moment. It will include WCAG 2.2. So if you start doing accessibility testing, if you start like working with clients, if you are a client who wants to make their stuff accessible, I recommend doing 3.2.1 plus the new 2.2 requirements, because then you don't have to start over when the new version comes out. It keeps the structure. There are a lot of changes. Some of them I think are like not that good, or like not that, like I don't know why they did it. So I asked for clarifications, but we don't, these things take time, and they will there will be an update at some point, and then we just look at the update and we do it, because we don't have anything else that we can do. And that's it. Thank you for being here. Like galloping 30 minutes through WCAG 2.2, mostly EN 301 549. My blog is yatil.net. follow me on Mastodon at yatil@yatil.social. And you can email me at eric.eggert@axsslab.com. And if you want to work with us and make your stuff more accessible and conform to EN, like if you have done WCAG 2 before and you're now, okay, what do we need to do in addition to meet the EN 301-549, then contact Sarah or Tina. You can use the link or the QR code and set up a meeting, and then we can figure out what you need to make that step and get conformant with EN 301-549. And now I'm ready for all the questions. And I say I'm ready, but like, so ready. Okay, so the first one from Vaya is sometimes I go to the Canadian version of EN 301-549 to use a web version instead of the PDF. Do you know if it's safe, meaning the content is the same as the PDF? Yes. For the version 3.2.1, it is the same, minus a little bit of preamble for Canada. So I guess they have a lot of abodes in there. But it's the same, and I often use it to reference two specific things if I want to. Next questions from Sander. WCAG success criteria can be tested quite consistently. How can you test the requirements that go beyond WCAG? Many EN clauses seem quite vague to me, and it seems to be interpreted in different ways. Yes. Personally, I think this is a huge problem. I think it's a lot more loosey-goosey in terms of like language and requirements. And that is a challenge. That also means it's a little bit more flexible than what you would expect from WCAG. But we also have like, first WCAG, like WCAG 2.0 was released in 2008. So that's 18 years of experience of testing WCAG. Of course, we're better than that, right? And I hope that the back and forth and like the new versions, and we can get, within 2 or 3 years, we can get into more a better understanding on how to test and like making sure that like the language of the EN also gets like more testable, or like at least a little bit more reliable, or like at least giving us like a better understanding of like what the like borders are of where we can move, because I don't think it's like necessarily bad that there is wiggle room, right? That we as accessibility experts can say, oh, I think in this use case you should do more, or you should be a little bit more accessible, or you should be like following best practices more. But where are the guardrails, and how is that going to be tested by the people who are going to test that? We don't know. Like, this is all very in the open, especially in regard to the EN. To the European Accessibility Act. So it's a lot of uncertainty. I agree, Sander, and like I hope we figure it out. Lots of thank yous. That's great. Martin says there is 11.7 user preferences and a list of stuff, but it is a list of examples of is it a list of examples of preferences or exactly those preferences? So 11.7 is one of these things that are getting a big overhaul in the version 4.1.0 that is going to come out. Some of that is for the better, some of that is for the more vague. So for example, instead of 11.7, especially some people have applied that to web as well, which, the EN says it can be applied to the web. But in the new version, there will be a 9.7 that basically says instead of like, oh, you have to meet those user preferences, you just are not allowed to prevent users from using your site. Like, I think it says block users that use those preferences. And that's something completely different than supported. And yes, it's only a list of examples. It's not exactly those preferences. Technically, it says you have to follow all the preferences that are supported by the technology that you're using. I don't know how you would test that, or like, how that, like in practice, how to make sure that you meet the standard, or yeah, like who says what the preferences are. But like, yeah, it's one of these open things that we just need to figure out in concert with the regulators, and like seeing how it works out with the 4.1.0 update. All right. Yeah, for example, the limited animation setting is not mentioned. Yeah, exactly. Reduced motion is not mentioned, I think. And like it's a little bit weird, but technically it's like, oh, you have to support everything. Which feels like a requirement that is like a little bit overly, like, basically it would mean that once, let's say, Microsoft puts a new feature into Windows, you would be required to support that. And now the new wording says block. You cannot block them, so you don't need to support, like in this case, like let's say dark mode or something like that. But you just need to make sure to not block someone from using your site when they are using dark mode, and that's much better, at least much more usable and much more practical than before. Then we have Shemina, I want to say. I've noticed that companies that comply with WCAG 2.1 or 2.2 often also declare compliance with DEN in their accessibility statements, even without a separate audit. Is that the expected practice? Basically, you say you conform to the EN, and therefore you meet the European Accessibility Act. You can do that, but if they look at your site and they find issues, like you have to like demonstrate that you are actually meeting the EN. And if you only meet WCAG 2.1 or 2.2, you don't. In your accessibility statement, you can write whatever you want. You can lie, which unfortunately a lot of people do, or at least like, making sure that they're like they look good in their accessibility statements. And I can relate to that. I also want to look good, but yeah, it's like can have severe consequences there. So yeah, you shouldn't do it. I think it's better to say we are meeting WCAG 2.1 and 2.2, and we are in the process of getting into conformance with the EN, because otherwise you will be in hot water. I assume most of the initial fines and stuff will be more about like not meeting bureaucratic requirements than actually failing accessibility issues, because the bureaucratic requirements are much easier to test. All right, looks like that's been all of the questions. Thank you very much. And yeah, have a good day. We don't know when the next one is. Sign up for our newsletter or whatever it is. I think we had a link in the registration page. And you get informed when the next of these webinars is. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye.